Hello, welcome to this presentation on the expressivity of parameterized and data-driven representations in quality diversity search. My name is Alexander Hagg and I'm presenting this work together with Sebastian, Alexander, Simon and Thomas. Quality diversity search, as most of you will know, has the goal of providing us with a diverse set of high-quality solutions that can be used in robotics, industrial design, architecture, digital arts, machine learning, planning, and many other domains. The general idea is that we separate the search space, that is usually defined by a manually encoded parameter set, and a niching space, which is defined by a small number of features that are calculated based on high-dimensional phenotypes. So we decode a parameter tuple into something like a large image or a robot trajectory or anything else. So by separating search space and niching space, we can indirectly search a phenotypic space and find a diverse set of high-quality solutions. So throughout this work, we use the manual domain encoding as follows. We have in A, you can see a genome consisting of 16 parameters that freely deform a base shape, in this case, almost circular polygon. This base shape is then, we apply a Catmull-Rom spline interpolation to this deformed base shape to produce a smooth shape. We can then discretize the shape into a bitmap and to determine the fitness of a shape, which is a symmetry-based fitness, we determine the boundary of this bitmap, and this boundary is then used in a simple fitness function to determine the rotational symmetry of this object. The cons are this requires expert knowledge. Even this simple example, you can understand that there is a lot of programming and thinking involved until this works. We need to invest resources to be able to do this. The pros are that this is a transparent representation, it's very easy to explain, and it's easily extendable as well. But when a manual encoding is too expensive or the domain's factors of variation are unknown, for example in very complex domains, we can use generative models to help us. For example, we use variational autoencoders to learn from raw data a latent encoding and estimate the factors of variation. The big pro is that obviously we can speed up the process that I described in the last slide and facilitate work in complex domains. The big con is that this entirely relies on the quality of the data. So what are the affordances of a latent space in QD? A VAE very simply consists of an encoder and a decoder part, where the encoder takes an input shape, projects it into a low-dimensional latent space. The latent space is then used as an input to the decoder to reconstruct the shape that we input in the beginning during training. The encoding step can be used as a compressed representation that provides us with a niching space by discriminating between two shapes. If we enter two shapes into the encoder, we get two different parameter tuples that we can measure distance on. We can also use the decoding step to generate from a latent vector a shape, which provides us with a search space. So we have a niching space through the encoder and a search space through the decoder. The research questions we asked are, how does a VAE perform as a generator and as a discriminator? The second question, how does QD perform on a learned encoding versus a manual encoding? We derive concrete recommendations for the use of latent spaces in QD search. So experiment 1, how does a VAE perform as a generator and as a discriminator? We used a set of base shapes, shown here in F in the bottom, and some known factors of variation, size and rotation, to create data sets on which we train the VAE. Then within these factors of variation, we define 3 tasks: recombination, interpolation, and extrapolation. Recombination, here we have a holdout set of shapes that are not used for training, but we have examples for all values of the feature space or the known factors of variation. In the interpolation case, we leave out an entire range of values for one of the factors of variation. And in extrapolation is similar to interpolation, except that this holdout set is at the end of one of these factors of variation. And we expect this to be harder for a VAE to learn. So 2 questions. Can the VAE generate left-out shapes, providing a searchable encoding space? And can the VAE discriminate left-out shapes, providing a good niching space? So let's look at the results. The first result is just to show you how we represent this in visualization. We have the base shape set on which we train the VAE. Then we have the latent space, the shapes in latent space projected on 2 dimensions using t-SNE. In yellow, you see the reconstructed training set. The black outline is the ground truth of the shapes. In the recombination task, when we hold out part of the shape set of the training set, we can see that the blue reconstructed holdout or non-training examples are situated quite regularly in the latent space. And the reconstruction, as you can see in this zoomed out region, is quite well as well. There are some pixel errors, but not a lot. In interpolation, we have a very similar image, but extrapolation, you can see that the variational autoencoder gets somehow at its limits. The generated shapes contain a lot of errors, so much so that the shapes do not barely resemble the original shapes in many cases. But the distances between the shapes are still there. We can still separate them. So in conclusion, here you would say that the niching would work well in this space, or well enough, but we cannot search this part of the search space because we cannot generate these shapes. So let's measure this on a larger number of experiments. For details, please refer to the paper itself. For generation, to determine how good a VAE is at generating or as a search space, we use the reconstruction error of the holdout set. And you can see that what I showed you in the example is shown in these metrics, in this metric as well. The training examples have a low error. Recombination and interpolation is a little bit harder because they are unknown novel shapes for the VAE. And extrapolation task is even harder. The discrimination is measured by measuring the pairwise latent distances in the entire set, so holdout and training set, because we have to be able to separate holdout examples from each other, but also from the training examples. And we can see the distribution of pairwise latent distances is quite similar for all 4 tasks. So this gives us some evidence that the search space works in the recombination or interpolation cases, but not as well in the extrapolation case, although some shapes are still represented somewhat correctly. But for niching space, the VAE should be better suited. Experiment 2, how does QD perform on a learned encoding versus a manual encoding? So the manual encoding, the parameter search, is shown on the left. Here, control points control the shape in a direct fashion, as you can see from this moving control point and its effect on the shape. Here we change just the radius of one of the control points. This is very easily understood when you look at this GIF. Latent search is a little bit different. Here, when we change one of the latent coordinates, the latent coordinates control the interpolation between training shapes, and it's much harder to explain this without visualizing the result, what changing this one parameter actually means. How do we combine QD and VAE? We repeat the figure I showed you in the beginning of parameters, phenotypes, and features, and niching in both cases. On the left, we see parameter search, where we use the VAE trained on an archive to provide us with latent coordinates that are used as features in the archive itself. This is done by Cully, by Grillotti, and by myself and by others. The other possibility is to replace the parameter search completely with a latent search. So we use the VAE both for niching as well as a latent encoding that produces high-dimensional phenotypes. So, of course, here the problem is, where do you start? You need to train the VAE with something to produce some results. So we need some kind of bootstrapping. This is done by Gaia and Fontaine. They use similar mechanisms to learn a representation. So other than parameter search or latent search, we can also change the size of the VAE's latent space in our experiments. We use 8, 16, and 32 dimensions. 16 is the number of dimensions that we use in the parameter search as well, so there are 16 genes. And there's 16 latent coordinates in this particular experiment. And the initialization, so how do we start? Where do we start? With what training set do we start? We use two different cases, the random initialization, so we have an archive of random shapes, and we bootstrap our VAE based on these random shapes to learn the latent space from this random set, and then perform QD to provide us with an optimized shape archive. And we have a continuation case in blue, which is non-bootstrapped, so we mimic the availability of known well-working examples in some domain. We learn the latent space based on this optimized set, perform QD search, and produce another further optimized shape archive. So let's look at the results. We show on the top the pure diversity, which is a metric that is explained in the paper, and on the bottom the total fitness of the entire shape set. So the pure diversity of the full shape set produced with parameter search with a bottleneck of 8 dimensions. So we use niching, the VAE for niching, but a parameter search as a search space. In the random, so bootstrap case, we see that the diversity of the parameter search is much higher than that of the latent search. The fitness is vice versa. When we now continue based on the last optimized shape set, we actually, this green one, the parameter searches shape set, we retrain the VAE, and now the trend is still very similar, but we see that the improvement of the latent search is higher than the improvement of the parameter search. This is the non-bootstrap version. We did this for 16 and 32 dimensions, and as you can see, the trend continues, but the diversity, the difference of diversity between PS and LS in a continuation case gets a little bit closer together, although there's still quite a significant difference, and parameter search still has a higher diversity than the latent search. You see the vice versa, the same trend we saw before and for fitness in the 16 and 32 dimensional cases, although the fitness in the 32 dimensional cases becomes quite similar. But there's still a significant difference. So here's an example. We show a shape set from the latent search and from the parameter search, where the latent search diversity is about half of that of parameter search. Just to give you an impression of the kind of shapes that we can produce with the auto VE using latent search versus parameter search. And on the bottom we show the latent space coordinates compressed into 2 dimensions using t-SNE again for visualization purposes. And the third dimension is the reconstruction error of a shape by the VAE. So in blue we see that the shapes that are produced by latent search are very close to 0 due to the fact that these are located on the manifold that was learned by the VAE. But in the parameter search case, we see that we always find examples that are not on the manifold, that are new to the VAE. So there is more evolutionary pressure when we use a manual encoding in this case, instead of a latent encoding. So the take-home messages. Latent space of a VAE can reproduce examples to a satisfying degree. It provides good recombination and interpolation capabilities. Known and unknown examples have a meaningful relationship to each other, and we can use the latent space as a representation space. We recommend, however, to use the learned encoding for comparison, so for as a feature space for niching in QD. Expanding beyond the latent space is less robust, and there's more evolutionary pressure from an external or manual encoding in this case. QD search in parameter space produces a solution set of higher diversity, so we recommend to perform search in parameter space wherever possible. Thank you for joining.